Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore philosophy. And before you turn off the podcast, hear me out. I'm not going to be dealing with really in-depth elements of philosophy. Rather, I want to look at this idea of enriching our own personal philosophy, or the well-examined life. And over two parts, what I want to do is look at the kind of material that really fleshes out a lot of our Masonic beliefs. So, we know that Masonry is a system of morality. It teaches us to subdue our passions, as I talked about in a previous episode, to become better men. Here, I want to look at what it has meant to be a better man in other societies. This is usually the realm of philosophy, looking at the idea of morals and ethics, making us question and reflect our own actions. And when I say that from a certain historical perspective. Now, today we would consider morals and ethics as part of religion. It's just part of what we do. It's part of the volume of sacred law, etc. But that has not always been the case. When societies were generally polytheistic up until really sort of the Roman period, the birth of Christianity, you could argue there are several other cultural births and religious births where we see monotheism, but at the end of the day, during a polytheistic or in a polytheistic society, what we find is religion is about identity. You have a god for your city or a god for your people. And if you lose a war, that god dies too. So it's all about identity. Morals and ethics, they're separate. They belong to areas of the law. That is, until we get these concepts of philosophy, people who really start to look at what it is to live life, really the professionals, for lack of a better term. And so in a period of time when we don't have judgment, sort of objective judgment from a supreme being, we see the development of philosophy. And that's what I want to look at. Is these ideas of philosophy, these ideas that existed in this very short period of time. As we're going to see, all of these philosophies come out of a few hundred years. And it's very unusual because we're going to be looking at different societies. Now, as such, I want to introduce you to about 7 different philosophical ideas that might get you thinking beyond our tools to systems that may well enrich and inform your life. Why do I want to do this? Well, Masonry lays out a beautiful, well-proportioned building on our trestle board. What it doesn't do is it doesn't tell us about the ornamentation. It doesn't tell us about the furnishings. It doesn't tell us about what kind of molding you're going to use. Rather, it gives us the framework. And I want to flesh out that framework. And I believe by looking at philosophies, this is a great way to do it, to understand how other people thought and allow that to inform our lives. Now, I'm going to be comparing these philosophies to each other, but also to Masonry, as well as unpacking the practical wisdom of these major philosophies, among which will include Stoicism, Existentialism, Buddhism, and others over the span of 2 episodes. But I've come across some interesting information. At least when you look at the history of philosophy, you come across something interesting. I made reference to it a minute ago. The axis of world history seems to pass through the 5th century BC. In the midst of the spiritual progress that we see sometime between about 600 and about 200 BCE, so we're looking at, a 400-year span, which saw the rise of Confucius, Lao Tse in China, so Taoism, the Upanishad and Buddha in India, the basis of Hinduism and Buddhism, Zarathustra in Persia, the Old Testament prophets in Palestine, Homer, the philosophers, the Trajans in Greece. All of these ideas are developing in this very short span, 600 or 800 BCE to about 200 BCE. So even at the longest, you're looking at a 600-year span where you see everything from the prophets of the Old Testament to the development of Buddhism and the development of Greek philosophy. Well, that is a remarkable thing. And let me point out, because I feel that I need to, being a little bit pedantic as a history and art history instructor or lecturer, at the end of the day, all of these societies were aware of each other because the Silk Road is active, probably starting around 600, if not a little bit earlier BCE. So definitely towards the beginning of this span, we know that there are Buddhists who will visit ancient Greece. We know there are ancient Greeks that are going to turn up in India as Buddhism arises and arguably gives them the concept of sculpting or creating images of the Buddha. So there's a lot going on. This becomes very complicated, but I'm going to try and keep it very, very clear, if at all possible. But before we do get into those philosophies, I want to look at this idea of a personal philosophy. Why look at it? What's the purpose of going through and presenting this material? Well, personal philosophy is ultimately a set of explanations, values, and principles by which we navigate existence. It's a framework that describes both what we think about the world and how we can best live in it. And this is what Masonry is trying to alter. It's trying to inform our personal philosophy. Crucially, whether we're conscious of it or not, we each already have a philosophy for life. It may have been shaped by family, culture, religion. Maybe it's something that you formed intentionally yourself, or simply something that came from others and you just kind of adopted. But the point is this: wherever it came from, and regardless of the extent to which we actively reflect on our personal philosophy, we all have a set of values and principles that underpin everything we do. From the career we choose, to the people we like and dislike, from the politicians we vote for, to the activities that fill our free time. In our day-to-day lives, our personal philosophies typically sit in the background, unchallenged. It's just sort of information that's there. But it's at the moments of crisis that it really comes out. That's where we try to apply our Masonic tools. That's where we try to apply the various teachings. And that's where it becomes really important. So in this moment of crisis, when we're wrestling with more abstract mysteries of life, that fundamental principle by which we navigate existence comes under the spotlight. For an established, battle-tested personal philosophy, it should exist to help us answer the following questions or similar questions, such as, how can I face up to my own mortality as well as that of a loved one? I mean, one of those questions Masonry definitely helps us with, but the other one, not so much. That's what I mean by fleshing out. What does it mean to live a good life, and how can I live one? Well, Masonry does answer that. What is worth my time? What isn't? What's the most important thing to prioritize? What do I owe to other people, and how can I cultivate better relationships? How do I balance what I owe to other people, to society, with my own obligations to myself? At what point do I move to being selfish, or do I become foolish in the use of my resources? Am I seeing the reality of my life clearly? How can I stop worrying about the future and derive more meaning and fulfillment from the here and now? This is the problem of anxiety, living so constantly in the future in this fear and concern about what will be that we don't actually pay attention to what is and the beauty that surrounds us. When I encounter problems, what guiding principles should I use to forge the best path forward? Are there any enhancements I can make in my outlook? So, with all of these questions, and there are more that I could definitely throw out there, we need something to help us answer those. And keep in mind that we don't need one philosophy. I would argue that there are many times where it becomes more of a toolkit. You reach in and you grab the right thing at the right time. And that's the most effective way, but to each their own. And when it comes to shaping personal philosophies, we don't have to start from scratch. Of course, Masonry gives us a framework to answer some of these questions, but it can be added to, as I said, fleshed out by looking at the ideas of people who, well, effectively, professionally thought about what it meant to be a good person, what it meant to live a good life, how to answer these questions. We don't go out and assume that we are financial experts because we took a 30-minute seminar on our 401k. So why do we suddenly presume that we are experts in our own personal philosophy? Why not look at what other people have said? So today our focus is on the exploration of the Greeks, the foundation of Western society. And to be really brief, I want to hit on, now I talked about Pythagoras in a lot more detail in a previous episode, and I really do encourage you to look that up. But Pythagoras, of course, plays a role in Masonry. Anytime you see Pythagoras mentioned, it means Greek thought, or at least I believe that it means Greek thought or secular thought, non-religious, non-moral teaching. The Pythagoreans talked about cosmic harmony. They used geometry to try and understand the universe around them. They believed that harmony was, well, for lack of a better term, like the force. It drew everything together, really, that everything was harmony in some way. He was also, most importantly, the first to be systematic about deductive reasoning, starting with an axiom that is self-evident, something that should be fairly obvious, and then proceeding step by step to a conclusion based on logic that is far from self-evident. So you have a series of questions based on one idea, and you just keep playing it out. You keep teasing it out until you get to something unusual, until you go beyond where most people would stop. Now, from him, we move to Socrates. Socrates being particularly important because he's kind of seen as the father of modern philosophy. This isn't entirely the case. Pythagoras is really the first to look at morals and ethics in philosophy. Before that, it was more science. But Socrates is looking at this philosophy of self-reflection. Now, we have discussed in the past the importance of self-reflection. Unfortunately, this sentiment is echoed in Socratic philosophy. Socrates is a wise old man whose philosophies from ancient Greece shaped our Western philosophy today. He's also famous for, among other things, ticking off a lot of people, being shabbily dressed, always barefoot, physically tough. He had a record of courage in battle, but spent most of his time arguing in the marketplace. And for him, he's moving towards this idea of focusing on morality, discovering the just, the true, the good. He would argue with people based on the idea of definitions. So you need to define all of your terms before you can really argue with Socrates on the base concept. This is what ticks people off a lot. And at a time when virtue was thought to be aristocratic, that it was inherited, it was almost genetic, at least according to the Greeks, Socrates argued that any person can learn and develop virtue. This is really similar to ideas of the Enlightenment meritocracy. So if this guy says, Socrates, that an unexamined life is not worth living, then we are 100% certain that he probably knows what he's talking about. And he argues that to live a better life, you must be willing to examine your life from an objective perspective. What does this mean? This means stopping, reflecting on your day. Maybe you take an evening shower. Maybe you lay in bed. And instead of scrolling through Insta-Snap-a-Chat-a-book, maybe what you should be doing is reflecting on various actions that you took during the day, the good, the bad, the indifferent, and thinking about how you could improve them. Why did you do the thing that you did? So it becomes really important to reflect, and that's the basis of Socrates. That's what he's talking about when he talks about the examined or the unexamined life. So this way, you see yourself for who you really are, and consequently, you'll discover where to make necessary changes. This self-reflection can also be done with a trusted friend, something that hopefully we all have within the fraternity, as we sometimes have blind spots that we need pointed out. I know I've had brothers in the past have difficult conversations with me and tell me that, hey, you need to focus on this, you need to stop being that, you seem to be this. And they were hard conversations at the time, as you can imagine. But yet they could see blind spots that I couldn't. They could see things from an outside perspective that just weren't obvious to me. And had they never pointed them out, I would have not gotten to where I am today as a partially employed art history instructor. But I would argue that you should probably aim higher than that moving ahead. So Socrates believes that in trying to become a better person through self-reflection exercises, we are on the path to genuine happiness, to becoming a better person. And by the way, to Socrates, philosophy isn't a profession, which is good, it doesn't pay well, but a way of life. It was who you were. So in other examples, Socrates would argue, for example, that when you're laying there in bed and you're kind of pondering your day, you look at things and you go, hey, I gave a gift card for $10 to a panhandler, and it was to McDonald's, and this was a very good thing, right? It seems very good, but if you continue to reflect on it, you notice a pattern. So you might go, well, why did I give them a McDonald's gift card? Why not give them cash? Well, I didn't want them spending it on alcohol and drugs. Then you get into some harder questions. Well, why do you think they're going to spend it on alcohol and drugs? What if what they needed was insulin? And that gift card isn't going to do them a lot of good. McDonald's is probably the wrong place to send them. And you see where this starts to get into an issue. You start to reflect and go, well, also, why do I assume that they're going to use it for this purpose? What base assumptions am I making? What mental filter exists? And is there something that I can do to get rid of that so that I'm no longer judging this person on their external appearance, and rather find a way to treat them either as equal or judge them by the content of their character? And these kind of reflections are incredibly important. This is how we grow and develop. We don't become better men because we take an obligation and we stand up at the altar. We become better men when we reflect on our decisions of the past. That being said, let's talk about Aristotle. Now, Socrates teaches Plato. If you want to read about Socrates, you need to find it primarily in Plato, in the Republic, and other dialogues. Plato is going to be teacher to Aristotle, who also teaches Alexander the Great, but that's a whole different ball of wax. Now, Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher who, like his legendary teacher Plato, is considered to be one of the most significant figures in the history of Western philosophy. One of the key innovations of Aristotle's philosophy for life, and Aristotle has a lot of philosophies on morals and science and everything else, but we're going to focus on this philosophy for life. And why it remains so enduring today is that it's a philosophy grounded entirely in the human world. It doesn't look beyond everyday human experience in order to declare what is good. Now, that might sound relatively uncontroversial. I mean, Socrates is the one saying, hey, anyone can have virtue, anyone can be good, you aren't born with it. And Aristotle's going to take it one step further. He's going to take this uncontroversial, what sounds like an uncontroversial approach, but many major philosophies and religions typically do look beyond the everyday to advise on what goodness is. Goodness is, or virtue, or proper character is taught to us by some transcendent idea, a realm, a supreme being. Aristotle says, no, that's not how this works. This is purely human experience. He says we are not born perfect beings, but we are also not born evil. We are born basically as a blank slate, and says almost all of us are capable of good lives. The more we try to act according to excellence or virtue, which, by the way, the 4 cardinal virtues come from Aristotle, over the course of our lifetime, the happier we will be. A key concept in his philosophy is for the good life is this idea very Greek idea of eudaimonia. And it's eudaimonia, a Greek word broadly meaning flourishing, sometimes translated as happiness. Importantly, Aristotle characterizes eudaimonia not as a feeling, but as an activity, not as a passive thing that we experience, but rather something that we go out and we do. To him, living a good, eudaimonic life means using rationality to flourish and fulfill our potential for excellence in everything that we do. So take pride in your work. Make sure that you're doing the right things. Aristotle tells us that while luck does play a significant role in determining how our lives will turn out, we are all responsible for improving our existence. And many of us are capable of excellence if we put our mind to it. The reward for excellence to him is happiness or flourishing. For far from a fleeting psychological state, eudaimonia consists in good rational activity, in knowing that we are living well and fulfilling our potential as human beings. Hedonic happiness, on the other hand, comes from the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, whereas eudaimonic happiness comes from the pursuit of authenticity, meaning, virtue, and growth. Yes, it's not going to bring you the spike in dopamine that you get from, a very desirable meal, or that you get from likes on Facebook. But what it does bring you is this constant flourishing, this constant contentment that's going to be particularly important. For Aristotle, living well thus means getting out into the world and acting excellently in the heat of day-to-day life. It means flourishing and fulfilling our potential in all that we do, building on that reflection that Socrates pointed out, because that's how we're going to learn how to handle this in day-to-day life. It means forging deep and meaningful relationships with our fellow beings while maintaining self-sufficiency. It means using reason to navigate all that life throws at us, taking that moment to pause before you make an emotional response or react to something that is happening around you, and creating happiness through the active, ongoing achievement of excellence. Not necessarily the sort of thing that gets you a certificate, but knowing that what you're doing in all circumstances is right, or as right as it can be in the moment. There is no ancient thinker who can speak more directly to the concerns and anxieties of contemporary life than can Aristotle. Nor is it clear that any modern thinker offers as much for persons living in this time of uncertainty. If you're interested in learning more about Aristotle, you might like some of the following: The Golden Mean, Aristotle's Guide to Living Excellently, or Aristotle on Why Leisure Defines Us More Than Work, or Aristotle on the 3 Types of Friendship and How Each Enriches Life. These are all books that are out there. Of course, there's more out there on Aristotle, and I recommend that you read any of them if you get a chance. Then we have Epicureanism, the idea of living for pleasure, not hedonistic pleasure, but we'll get to that. Hedonism, pleasure, yes, they kind of go together, but not always. This is philosophy. Not everything looks or acts as you would expect. Aristotle was not the only ancient Greek with big ideas about how we should live our lives. We also have Epicurus, on whose teachings Epicureanism is based. And he disagreed with the demanding elitism of Aristotle's ethics, basically saying that a cheerful poverty is an honorable state. So what he's doing is something a little bit different. While excellence is important, to him it's not what happiness and the good life are really guided by. He believes there's more to it. The reality to him is far simpler. Epicurus claims the good life is one in which pleasure and tranquility are maximized and pain is minimized. So through Epicureanism, though Epicureanism, is often mischaracterized as some kind of debaucherous form of hedonism, Epicurus actually saw philosophy as a kind of therapy. We make mistakes about ourselves in reality, Epicurus thought, And these mistakes can cause a great deal of anxiety, and that's what's causing the issues. Again, this internal mental suffering. This will be a theme we come back to with a number of philosophies, leading to ultimate suffering. In other words, we create our own suffering. Through careful use of philosophical reasoning, however, we can knock the wind out of our false beliefs, rid ourselves of the pain they cause, and live a life of pleasure and tranquility. As the ancient Epicurean philosopher Lucretius tells us, Epicureans think the ultimate good for human nature is as follows: to avoid bodily pain. Okay, we can all agree with that, right? We want to avoid that. To have a mind free from anxiety and fear, and to enjoy the pleasures of the senses, because he believes pleasure is a positive thing. This emphasis on simple pleasures distinguishes Epicurus from other Greek thinkers of the time, including Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno's Stoics, whose characterization of the good life, as we have seen with Aristotle and we'll see in the future with the Stoics, focuses less on pleasure and more on the pursuit of excellence and virtue. Another distinguishing factor is that unlike those rival schools, Epicurus's garden admits women and slaves, although we will see the Stoics do similar things. We also see his school, basically Epicurus's garden, which was far from a debaucherous party. It thought that life in the garden was sort of a perfect balance. And what we find is something remarkably simple. The prevailing diet consisted mainly of bread, water, beans, and a little wine. And the Epicureans would spend their days learning, resting, cultivating friendships, avoiding public life, and discussing philosophy. So what they're doing is they're living a simple life. And you go, well, where's the hedonism come in? Well, part of the reason they live that simple life, this very simple diet of bread, water, beans, and wine, is so that when they do have that delicacy, when they do have that steak, for example, they're going to take that much more pleasure in it. And we've all been there. We've all had that thing that our parents wouldn't get us, and then sometime in high school or college, when you had money available, you just went crazy on that thing. Could be ice cream, could be whatever. And suddenly it just didn't have as much value. And that's really where the Epicureans are going. So live simply so you can truly enjoy indulgence. We see this today. So for example, imagine the indulgence of having one cookie a week versus a package of cookies every day. The package every day becomes a commodity. It's simply something that you have, whereas that one per week becomes particularly special. So, though often caricatured as rather indulgent, pleasure-obsessed philosophies, Epicureanism is actually more about living a life free from anxiety, bodily pain. So anxiety, they get rid of by questioning it. Bodily pain, by simply avoiding it. And they place a strong emphasis on fellowship, friendship, and community in the search of meaningful, happy human life. And that idea of community we're getting from Aristotle as well. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Epicureanism, you might look at Epicureanism Defined, Philosophy is a Form of Therapy, or Epicurus's Principal Doctrines, 40 Aphorisms for Living Well, or Epicurus on Why Death Should Not Concern Us. So a lot of different ideas out there, definitely a philosophy to look at. But the next one we get to is often particularly misunderstood. Stoicism is about beating anxiety. Like Epicureanism, Stoicism, the final philosophy for life that we're going to look at in this episode, and from ancient Greece, suffers from being particularly misunderstood. Today, when we look at the Stoics, when we talk about Stoicism, we're constantly talking about it as if it's some kind of magical force field that stops us from feeling bad things and really feeling all things, stiff upper lip and all that. And that's really not what Stoicism is. So Stoicism at its base is this idea of facing destiny with courage and dignity. For a Stoic, the highest good was a life of virtue, consisting of prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, although often the Stoics replace prudence with wisdom, which, by the way, we covered in another episode. So, The Stoics basically argue that you have to live a life of virtue and you have to question your thoughts. And it goes a little bit deeper than that. Now, just as Epicureanism is often mischaracterized as involving reckless self-indulgence, so Stoicism is wrongly thought to be about repressing our emotions and living with a stiff upper lip. But Stoicism's approach is far more sophisticated than grit your teeth. In fact, their aim is to enhance our perspectives in such a way that we'll never need to grit our teeth again. Stoicism is founded by the ancient Greek thinker Zeno, who actually was a merchant or trader. His ship wrecks. He ends up in Athens, basically destitute, effectively an immigrant to the land. And he starts studying philosophy. And early on, he goes to the Oracle of Delphi, who tells him to take on the color of dead men. Well, that's kind of an odd thing to say, but what it means is take on the ideas of dead men or philosophers, which is exactly what he does. So he's there at the same time Epicurus is establishing the garden. Unfortunately, we don't have any of Zeno's works. They're just lost to history. Our knowledge of Stoicism thus comes mainly from the three major Roman practitioners: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Seneca is fairly well born. He has a pretty comfortable life. He is put to death by Nero. Epictetus is a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, of course, an emperor. Each of whom knew the now lost ancient Greek works and built upon them with their own hugely influential contributions. And this Greek form that is lost after the fall of Rome. So it's something they would have known, but others today do not. The three major Roman Stoics do not present many arguments for why Stoicism as a broader philosophy is true. Interestingly, they mostly presume that it's true. They then go on to discuss the ethical and psychological lessons that come from it. What are these lessons? Well, let's break down a couple of them. First of all, virtue is the only thing that matters. Following these ideas of wisdom, temperance, justice, fortitude, to a Mason, those should sound particularly familiar. And arguably, a lot of the Western world is built, or at least the ideal of the Western world, is built on Stoicism. So to them, one of the first rules is being a good person is the only thing that matters. Then there's the idea that anyone can actually be a good person, regardless of circumstances. But perhaps the argument that gets them into the most trouble, and yet is possibly the most important, is this idea of our well-being, that we create our own well-being, and understanding the dichotomy of control. So the idea being you have power over your own mind, not outside events. Once you realize this, you find strength. So what does this mean? Basically, in most thought processes, in most philosophies, the idea is if Bob gets into an argument with me, then we have two things. We have the cause, Bob getting into an argument, and the effect, whatever I say. What Stoicism says is that no, there's a third step. There's judgment. And so Bob, who I've already judged as he walks up to me, because I know Bob, and he's kind of an angry person, and he's got these odd ideas about chemtrails or whatever else, and he's coming up to me to start this argument. And the effect that I have, the ideas that I have of this whole thing, the emotions that come up from it, are actually in reaction to the judgment that I have of Bob and possibly of his argument. It is not about what's actually being said to me. And therefore, I can control it. So, Bob argues with me, I go, are these ideas good and true? Are they being colored by my perspective on Bob? And when I come to an answer on that, which should be, hey, there might be a kernel of truth in these arguments. Maybe there's not. But what it allows me to do is use my rational mind rather than an emotional response. It allows me to subdue my passions in my response to him. It causes me to take that break. It also causes me to recognize those things in life that I can control and those things that I cannot. The Stoics would say that there's no reason to fear or be concerned about those things that you cannot control, because you cannot control them, and so your fear serves no purpose. For example, death. The Stoics would say we just accept that death is coming. There's nothing to fear. No one knows what's coming from it except people who are dead, and they're not telling us. And so at the end of the day, fine. It's going to happen. It's far better to accept it than it is to fight against it. So it's all about that judgment and basically questioning our ideas. So you go through the day, you go, hey, that's a large, bald person. Well, why did I make that judgment? Large and bald. Instead of saying someone got absolutely sloshed and made horrible decisions last night, you might say, in Stoic philosophy, they drank a good bit last night. You remove the judgments from things. And when you remove those judgments, it allows you to focus on the judgments when they come up in your mind and interactions, which allows you to have more virtuous, more appropriate responses to whatever stimulus comes up. So part of it is recognizing that others have it worse. This idea of sort of having the right frame around things, recognizing that even the poorest can find someone poorer than them. Recognizing the fleeting nature of life. After all, we're only here for so long, so it doesn't really help me in any way to argue with Bob. Or should I instead focus on a solution? Recognizing your cognitive filters and constantly questioning them. As we talked about, that idea that literally we create our own suffering, either by focusing on anxieties of the future or by responding based on these mental filters, this judgment that we have in our mind that comes between the cause and the effect. So we create our own suffering by wanting what we don't have, rather than having what we own or wanting what we own. Why want an iPhone if you're not going to be able to afford it when you've got an older iPhone, but it's perfectly functional? It does all of the things that it needs to do. Is there really a need to have that desire? And it's not that they say have no desires, it's that they say question them. Think about them. Socratic self-reflection. So live simply and worry less as a result of these teachings. And by the way, all the Greek philosophies have this sort of live simply element, usually a middle way. They're not really very ascetic, where you don't eat anything for pleasure, for example. But they're also not particularly hedonistic, as we saw, for example, with the Epicureans. Instead, they find this middle way. Now, to see why Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius continue to inspire millions of people today, consider some of the following. Books on Stoicism. The Dichotomy of Control, a Stoic device for a tranquil mind. Or Stoicism and Emotion. Don't repress your feelings, reframe them. Or Seneca. Seneca wrote a bunch of letters that capture a lot of Stoicism. And he writes to find peace, stop chasing unfulfillable desires. Or Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, which is probably one of the most famous of the Stoic writings of the ancient world. So what I've hoped to do here in this episode is to provide you with a tool chest that may speak to the problems you face in day-to-day life. Now, many of them have common features. For example, living a virtuous life or self-reflection. But many also have a great deal in common with Masonry. Like all things, we see different paths towards the same goal. Really, Masonry, these philosophies, have the same general principle in mind. How do I live a good life? How do I best serve my community? And they all speak to that. At the end of the day, what I'm hoping is that I'm adding a few more tools to your tool chest. Now, these are not ones that we discuss within Masonry, but that doesn't mean that they're any less important or any less useful to your future. Next time, we're going to look at Eastern and modern ideas of the good life and how to get there. But until then, Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Licky, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.